I want to raise the question of whether these justice contestations are they unique to the ICC, or do we also find them in other types of transitional justice institutions? And my answer to the question is yes and no. I do think that we also find diverse justice ideas in other institutions, but I think that they are much less important in actually influencing how these institutions work and how they implement justice. And I think a very instructive comparison here is between the ICC and domestic criminal courts, which have seen much less in terms of justice contestations. And to understand why the ICC, why we have much more justice contestations at the ICC than at domestic criminal courts, we really have to appreciate the difference in legitimacy here. And now comes a bit more academic stuff. According to Max Weber, when we talk about legal institutions derive their legitimacy from their claims to rationality. And when it comes to legal rationality, we can distinguish between two types, broadly speaking. One is substantive rationality, and the other is procedural rationality. So criminal courts are substantively rational because they aim to achieve substantive ideas of justice. Deterrence, accountability, victim satisfaction, rule of law, peace, you can go on and on. But criminal courts are also rational because they're procedurally rational. They operate according to procedural criteria, especially due process, fair trial rights, expeditious trials. And I think when a justice system is well established, and usually that's the case with domestic criminal courts, which have very time-tested, very clear justice procedures, the only really standard to which we subject these courts is procedural justice. That's the only thing we really ask. So domestic criminal courts are never really challenged on substantive grounds. No one says to a German criminal court, hey, let's just establish a truth commission instead of this. So it's a very different, we sometimes ask whether a particular trial was fair, or we may ask whether there was sufficient evidence, but we usually never question whether these institutions should exist in the first place, or what type of justice they actually bring to the victims or to society. That's not something we care about. And I think the consequence is that even if justice practitioners at domestic criminal courts have different justice ideas, it doesn't really influence this well-oiled machinery of very established justice procedures.
No, I think it's very important, and as many people have pointed out, speakers today and people like Mamdani, for example, in discussions of the court, that transitional justice has to do with coming to terms with the past and with healing divisions, conflicts within society. It's very important that what transitional justice does and what it means is brought to society itself, to the actual community, if it's going to achieve the wider purpose of, as I say, coming to terms with the past and to, in a way, make a clean break with the past and get a fresh foundation for a future of reconciliation. Also in the Ethiopian case, I think our own exercise of transitional justice was very important in all respects, and I think a comparatively successful one, and it has received very little public attention here or outside Ethiopia. So I do think these discussions are extremely useful.
Couvrir la justice pénale, et en particulier la justice pénale internationale, comporte un certain nombre de défis. Le premier défi, en tout cas selon l'expérience de l'agence Hirondelle, c'est la langue juridique. En effet, il n'est pas toujours aisé de traduire dans un langage accessible et de rendre en très peu de mots de longues heures de discussion, de débats judiciaires ou des centaines de pages de requêtes, de mémoire ou de jugement. La langue du droit est souvent rébarbative pour les non-initiés et le sujet lui-même paraît souvent aride pour certains journalistes, si bien que dans certaines salles de rédaction, que ce soit dans les journaux, les radios ou les télévisions, parfois on a des difficultés à trouver des journalistes qui choisissent de se spécialiser en matière de justice. Vient un autre défi, c'est l'obligation de neutralité et d'équilibre, qui pose problème dans certains cas particuliers lorsque des journalistes sont obligés de couvrir des situations qu'ils ont vécues d'une façon ou d'une autre. Les journalistes sont des êtres humains, mais il y a également des exigences professionnelles auxquelles ils doivent absolument répondre. Si on prend l'exemple d'un journaliste rwandais comme moi, qui couvre le tribunal pénal international pour le Rwanda, bon, au Rwanda, on peut avoir des membres de famille qui ont été massacrés pendant le génocide. D'un côté, on a également des membres de famille qui sont en prison pour avoir été impliqués dans le génocide. Ce n'est pas facile à gérer quand on est journaliste, mais il faut le faire. La déontologie est là, les règles sont claires, il faut les respecter. Et quand on estime qu'on ne peut pas les respecter, mieux vaut ne pas le faire. Enfin, je vais parler des pressions et des risques. Quand on suit des audiences dans un prétoire, dans une salle d'audience, on ne court bien sûr pas les mêmes risques que le confrère qui couvre le conflit au Soudan du Sud, au Mali, en République centrafricaine ou en Syrie. Mais cela ne veut pas dire qu'en couvrant la justice pénale internationale, il n'y a pas de risque, et qu'il n'y a pas de pression. Les pressions peuvent s'exercer, s'exprimer de plusieurs façons. Bon, ici je relate sans entrer dans le détail ma propre expérience où un avocat vous appelle, un avocat de la défense, et il vous dit, parfois avec des insultes, que votre travail ne vise qu'à dénigrer son client. J'allais dire sa cliente, là, les observateurs qui suivent régulièrement la justice pénale internationale pouvaient facilement savoir à quelle personne je fais allusion. Et il menace de vous traduire en justice. Et il ne mettra jamais sa menace à exécution. Il veut, tout simplement pour vous intimider. Oui. Parce qu'il veut que vous rapportiez les faits d'une façon qui favorise son client ou sa cliente. Il y a des fois, un procureur m'a envoyé un mail pour me dire « Vous écrivez du n'importe quoi, je ne vous lirai plus. » Ou alors, et il ajoute « Surtout, ne venez plus m'interroger. » C'est une sorte de menace. Ou alors, moi je suis rwandais, un Rwandais m'appelle, un coup de fil anonyme, il me dit « Ah, toi, tu défends la cause des génocidaires. » Et un autre me dit « Toi, tu défends plutôt le régime au pouvoir à Kigali. » Ce sont des appels que j'en ai reçus de ce genre. Voilà, en quelques mots, c'était ça l'expérience que je voulais partager avec vous. Et je le répète encore une fois, il ne s'agit pas de recettes applicables à n'importe quelle situation. C'est une histoire que j'ai racontée parce que c'est mon métier. Mon métier ne consiste pas à faire des exposés, mais à poser des questions. Je vous remercie.
I think this debate is very important to be discussed at all the levels. The local levels, where people do not even understand the importance of traditional justice and rather choose their own local mechanisms. And also in the middle ground where governments might not understand where transitional justice starts from and goes. And at the international level, we also have these debates which are contested. So all these areas are contested, and bringing this discussion in all these forums are very, very much important. I can see the prospects from the local community or local intermediaries having some kind of policy community which knows the meaning of justice and the definition of justice that transcends from the local, the national, and the international. And I think this debate must always go through and institutions, communities, policymakers at all levels. I see this very as a very important forum. The institutions like IPSS is one starting point which is very good. I would also want to see this discussion at the AU, where there are contestations and misunderstanding of the notion of justice itself. And if you add the word next to justice, which is transitional, it becomes even more complicated. Transitional from where to where, and why, and the historical perspectives of crimes and perpetration, and the contestation between criminal justice and restorative justice systems. They all transcend and they need to be discussed. And I think the middle ground for this discussion is the transitional justice discussion at all the levels.
We are living in an amazing time, right? Where we are moving away from everything we knew to a completely connected world, where everything you do is not just what it is supposed to be, but it's also leaving traces behind you, small bits of information. Your cell phone provider can tell you we're attending this meeting because they see where you are from your cell phone tower, and maybe somebody Googled, or not Googled, posted on Twitter, hey, I'm at this meeting, and then there will be videos on YouTube, and so I can pretty much know a lot of things about you. I can not only tell what you do, but I can tell what you think at times, your emotions. And there's been a famous recent study on Facebook playing with people's attitudes and moods and sentiments. Now, it's a bit of a scary world, right? There is no more anonymity. We're all connected. There is so much information out there that probably your cell phone provider knows more about you, what time you go to work, where you work, who are your friends, than anybody else. Now, that's the scary part, but it's also presenting a number of opportunities, because we can tell much better than ever before exactly that, what you think. Do you think this justice mechanism is working or not working? I can look at social media posting to try to determine that. There was a judgment against some criminal. What do people say about it? How is it being perceived in the population? And so we can use that kind of information to improve early warning, but also improve on the information that's available on any given situation to better understand the dynamic in a country. So the second point is, on that technology aspect, is going back to the risks. So we are presented with these amazing opportunities in better understanding the world around us. It's also giving opportunities to completely change around how we respond to conflicts. Because in the past, a conflict early warning system would be what? We collect information, some warning is triggered because the information points to some risk, and so it's transferred to the higher-ups in the leadership, who determines, yes, that's true, that warning is important, and so it goes higher and higher and higher until somebody makes a decision about it. It's no longer the case. It's completely inverted, because that warning that you detected, it's on Twitter, it's on Facebook, everybody knows about it. So everybody now can become involved in response, in prevention, or in catalyzing conflict. But we live in a much more open world around these kind of warning and response processes.
I work at the Embassy of Belgium in Addis Ababa, and every day I get a lot of emails, a lot of requests, and I don't always open emails, so being invited to a seminar to discuss a certain topic is excellent to get to know a topic into depth. Before I didn't know the Fondation Hirondelle, so today was the perfect opportunity to get to know the foundation and to know what they're doing. I heard today for the first time about justiceinfo.net. So it was an ideal opportunity to learn more about the activities of the foundation. I also found it very interesting to hear the opinions of academia, of other colleagues, diplomats. So I think that was really an excellent opportunity to be here today and to get more information on what you guys do in the field.
Je vais intervenir tout juste pour donner quelque chose que vous connaissez déjà, mais dont moi j'ai l'expérience, vous allez obtenir quelque chose de plus. Au mois d'août 1990, j'étais à la réunion syndicale à l'hôpital où je travaille, lorsque deux individus m'appellent et m'embarquent dans une voiture en direction des locaux de la direction de la police politique du dictateur Hissène Habré. Torturé, j'étais dans une cellule souterraine pendant une semaine. Je ne pouvais pas manger avec mes mains qui sont paralysées par la torture dite méthode Arbatashar. Je mangeais directement avec la bouche comme le font les animaux. Dans la prison où je suis transféré, après la semaine de torture, j'ai rencontré plusieurs personnes dont certains sont à bout de souffle. À leur vue, je voyais des images des prisonniers de la Gestapo pendant la guerre mondiale. Où les massacres des Juifs et d'autres citoyens étaient honteusement présentés. Tous les prisonniers sont affamés et malades. Les aliments servis aux prisonniers ne sont ni de qualité, ni en quantité suffisante pour permettre à l'organisme humain de tenir. Parfois, les geôliers demandent combien y a-t-il de cadavres. Si on lui répond il y a un ou deux, il dit lorsqu'il y aura plus, vous me faites signe afin que j'ouvre la porte pour les enlever. Quel sadisme! Quel sadisme! Je veux conclure comme ça. La vérité sur Hissène Habré est que c'est un dictateur qui n'hésite pas de tuer. Présentement, il est poursuivi par la justice créée par des Africains avec siège à Dakar, au Sénégal. La crainte des victimes que nous sommes est de voir bâcler le procès de Hissène Habré. Pour nous, victimes, il ne s'agit pas de nous indemniser, mais plutôt juger le tortionnaire. Nous avons besoin que justice soit rendue dans la transparence.